The chair beside me had been empty for 47 minutes. It was an ordinary government chair, gray plastic, metal legs, a faint scratch across the seat, but I had spent the morning treating it as if it were sacred. Matthew's suit jacket had rested over the back when we arrived. His hand had covered mine while we checked in. He had kissed my temple and told me that this time, nothing would interfere. Now his jacket was gone, and the marriage registration office at the Boston courthouse was preparing to close. I sat in a simple white suit with a bouquet of 6 calla lilies across my lap. Around me, strangers began marriages with signatures, nervous laughter, and photographs taken beneath fluorescent lights. Each time the inner door opened, another couple emerged wearing the stunned expressions of people whose lives had changed in less than 10 minutes. My life had not changed. Not yet. Sloane. The clerk at the reception window had asked my name so often that she no longer needed to check the appointment sheet. "Do you want me to move you to the last available slot?" she asked gently. "We can wait a little longer, but both parties must be present." "He'll be here." The answer came automatically. I looked down at my phone. Matthew's last message had arrived 9 minutes earlier. "Owen is still upset. Give me another 20 minutes." 20 minutes had become the unit by which Matthew measured how much of my life I was expected to surrender. The first time we missed our marriage appointment, Owen had suffered a severe asthma attack at school. Matthew had received the call while we were driving to the courthouse and turned the car toward Boston Children's Hospital without asking me. I had agreed before he could explain. Owen was 8 years old, terrified, and struggling to breathe. His father, Andrew, had died 4 years earlier. His mother, Camille, had panicked so badly that she could barely answer the emergency physician's questions. Matthew had stayed until Owen was stable, and I had sat beside Camille all night. I never counted that day against him. The second ceremony had been different. 30 minutes before our appointment, Camille called because a pipe had burst in the townhouse she and Owen shared. Water was pouring through the kitchen ceiling. Matthew promised he would meet the plumber, shut off the water, and return within half an hour. He stayed until the following morning. By the time he came home, the emergency plumber had been gone for 11 hours. Matthew had helped Camille call the insurance company, move boxes out of the damaged rooms, take Owen to dinner, and choose a hotel. He explained each additional decision as if no single one could justify my anger. I had been unreasonable, he said, to expect him to leave a widow and a child in distress. I had reminded him that Camille possessed a phone, an insurance policy, close friends, paid contractors, and an entire board of employees at the Andrew Sterling Memorial Foundation. Then I had said the words Matthew apparently believed were symbolic. "If you miss the next ceremony, there will not be a fourth." He had held my face between his hands and promised there would never need to be. That morning, he had arrived at the courthouse 12 minutes early. For almost half an hour, I believed him. Then Camille called. She was hosting the Foundation's annual luncheon at the Harbor Exchange Center. Owen had become panicked after seeing a large portrait of his father backstage. He was crying, refusing to enter the ballroom, and asking for Matthew. "Call Dr. Feldman," I had said. "She's Owen's therapist." "Or take him home. He doesn't have to attend the luncheon." Matthew had stared at me as though I had suggested leaving Owen alone on a sidewalk. "He's asking for me. And Dr. Feldman has spent 2 years helping him manage these episodes. Camille can't think clearly when he gets like this. Then one of the foundation staff can drive them home." "You're being incredibly cold." "We are 7 minutes away from getting married. That doesn't mean I can ignore a frightened child." "I didn't ask you to ignore him. I offered 2 reasonable options." Matthew had already been reaching for his jacket. 20 minutes, he said. "Don't leave without me." I looked at the inner door where the clerk would soon call our names. "If you walk out that door, you're the one leaving." He hesitated. For one breath, I thought he had finally heard me. Then he left. At 2:30, the clerk moved our appointment to the final slot of the day. At 3, Matthew wrote that Owen was still upset. At 3:26, he said Camille could not handle the luncheon alone. At 3:51, he asked for another 20 minutes. I responded with one question. "Are you returning to the courthouse today?" He did not answer it. At 4:12, another message appeared. You know how much I owe Andrew. I read it until the words blurred. Andrew had been Matthew's older brother, protector, business partner, and closest friend. After Andrew died in a boating accident, Matthew had stepped into every space his brother left behind. He became Owen's emergency contact, attended parent-teacher conferences, reviewed Camille's finances, managed foundation crises, and spent every anniversary of Andrew's death with them. At first, I admired his loyalty. Then loyalty became an answer to every objection. If Camille called during our anniversary dinner, Matthew answered because of Andrew. If Owen's school event overlapped with my award ceremony, Matthew chose Owen because of Andrew. If Camille needed a last-minute escort to a charity gala on the evening of my mother's retirement dinner, Matthew went because of Andrew. Grief was not the problem. Owen was not the problem. The problem was that Matthew used his debt to his dead brother like an unlimited line of credit, and I was always the one expected to pay it. At 4:17, my phone vibrated again. The email was not from Matthew. Final confirmation, Gulf Regional Resilience Program. I had interviewed for the position 3 months earlier after a former professor quietly submitted my name. The program was developing disaster-resistant medical clinics across coastal Louisiana and remote Gulf communities. They needed an engineering director who understood flood zones, modular construction, emergency power, and medical infrastructure. They wanted me. It was the kind of work I had imagined doing before my career became tangled with sterling construction and my future became limited to places Matthew was willing to live. The offer had arrived 10 days ago. I had almost rejected it. Matthew refused to consider relocating to New Orleans, even temporarily. Sterling Construction was headquartered in Boston. Camille depended on him. Owen needed consistency. Our children, if we had them, would need to grow up near family. Once we're married, we need one stable life, he had told me. Not two competing careers. He had said it with such certainty that I almost failed to notice which career was expected to stop competing. The acceptance deadline was 5 o'clock. I closed the email without responding. At 4:30, the clerk approached me instead of calling from the window. We close at 5, she said. If he isn't here by 4:45, the officiant won't have enough time to complete the registration. I understand. Would you like me to call him? No. It was the first answer I had given all afternoon that felt true. At 4:40, I opened the Foundation's public livestream. I told myself I was checking whether Owen was all right. The video showed a ballroom flooded with afternoon light. Blue and silver banners hung behind a stage bearing Andrew's name. Donors sat at round tables while a string quartet played beside a wall of windows overlooking the harbor. The camera moved across the children's activity area. Owen was there. He was not crying. He was laughing with 2 other boys as they raced model rescue boats through a plastic pool. An event volunteer helped him adjust one of the sails. He looked happy, occupied, and entirely capable of surviving Matthew's absence. The camera returned to the stage. Matthew stood beside Camille. He straightened her microphone, leaned close to say something that made her smile, and placed a steadying hand beneath her elbow as she approached the podium. To anyone watching, they did not look like a widow and her former brother-in-law. They looked like a family. The host introduced Matthew first. Andrew Sterling believed that communities survive when people refuse to abandon one another. No one has honored that belief more faithfully than Andrew's brother, the man who kept Andrew's family whole. Applause filled the ballroom. Matthew lowered his head with practiced humility. Camille reached for his hand. My bouquet tightened beneath my fingers. Then the lights dimmed. Today, Camille announced, we are proud to continue Andrew's legacy with the largest project in our foundation's history. A rendering appeared on the screen behind her. My rendering. For 5 years, I had developed SafeSpan, a modular clinic system designed for communities cut off by hurricanes, floods, or infrastructure failure. The raised foundation could withstand storm surges. The wall panels could be transported on ordinary trucks and replaced individually after damage. Solar storage, water purification, and emergency treatment zones could operate for days without the main grid. The first framework existed before I joined Sterling Construction. My notebooks contained the original calculations. My graduate research contained the first structural models. When Matthew recruited me, my employment contract specifically classified SafeSpan's core system as pre-existing intellectual property. Sterling Construction had later financed additional testing. Its engineers helped adapt certain components. But the central design was mine. On the live stream, my 5 years of work slowly rotated beneath someone else's name. Andrew Sterling, Coastal Relief Center. Founder and design vision leader, Camille Sterling. My name did not appear. Camille described the structure's flood-resistant base, independent utility core, rapid assembly treatment wings, and community shelter capacity. She repeated phrases I had written in presentations to Matthew and the Sterling board. Safe medical care should never depend on a community's zip code, she said. That sentence had closed my graduate thesis. The camera cut to Matthew applauding. A reporter asked him how involved he intended to remain in the project. As involved as necessary, he said. Andrew trusted me to look after his family, and I take that responsibility seriously. Camille looked at him with shining eyes. Matthew placed his hand over hers. I will always be wherever Camille and Owen need me. The applause began again. I lowered the phone. For almost 4 years, I had treated every interruption as an isolated emergency. A sick child, a flooded kitchen, a memorial, a difficult evening, a frightened widow, a promise made to a dead brother. But Matthew knew where I was. He knew what time the courthouse closed. He knew this was the 3rd ceremony. He knew exactly what I had said after the 2nd. He had not been trapped at the luncheon. He had chosen to stay. And while I sat beside his empty chair, he had stood beneath television lights and handed my work to Camille. Miss Bennett. The clerk was waiting near the office door. It's 4:54, she said. I'm sorry, but we need your decision. I looked at the unused marriage license on my lap. For 3 years, Matthew had made decisions that shaped my life and presented them as circumstances neither of us could control. Camille needed him. Owen needed him. Boston needed him. Sterling Construction needed me. The timing was unfortunate. The sacrifice was temporary. The next date would be different. I stood. I won't be rescheduling. The clerk's expression softened. Are you sure? Yes. I returned the license through the window. Then I removed my engagement ring. A pale indentation circled my finger. At 4:57, I reopened the Gulf Regional Resilience Program email. The position required relocation within 6 weeks. It gave me independent authority over clinic engineering, regional partnerships, and implementation. I would no longer be refining ideas that emerged with someone else's name attached to them. At 4:58, I clicked accept. The confirmation screen appeared almost immediately. For a few seconds, I let myself feel the full force of what I had done. Then I began protecting the decision. I called my intellectual property attorney and left a concise message describing the foundation announcement. I requested immediate preservation of SafeSpan's original drawings, development timestamps, prototype records, contractual classifications, and company access history. Next, I emailed the independent engineering firm that had witnessed the earliest load tests and asked them to secure copies of all certified records. Finally, I notified Sterling Construction's Human Resources Director that I had accepted another position. I would submit formal notice after legal review and complete a documented transfer of all company-owned materials and active project responsibilities. I did not resign in fury. I did not destroy files, send accusations, or give Matthew an opportunity to call me irrational. By the time I left the courthouse, my work was being preserved, my departure was being documented, and my future no longer required his permission. Matthew came home at 8:23. I was in the living room, separating my books from his, when he entered carrying a black velvet jewelry case and a courthouse envelope. There you are. He sounded relieved. Your phone has been going straight to voicemail. I turned it off. He placed the velvet box on the coffee table. I know today was awful. I looked at the gift, but did not touch it. The jeweler finally received the necklace you liked, he continued. I thought we could have dinner, reset, and choose a new date. He removed a new marriage appointment form from the envelope. The 4th one. Camille needed me, he said. Owen needed stability. I couldn't leave while the luncheon was underway. Owen was playing with model boats. Matthew paused. You watched the live stream? I watched enough. Then you saw how important the announcement was. I saw you give Camille my work. That isn't what happened. Her name was on my design. Mine wasn't. She's the foundation's public representative. The center needs a recognizable face to attract donors. And apparently an engineer does not need credit for designing it. You're taking this personally. It is my intellectual property. How should I take it? His jaw tightened. SafeSpan was refined using Sterling resources. The core framework predates my employment. You know that. Sloan, the company's engineers developed the final system. They developed later adaptations. SafeSpan is specifically listed in my contract under pre-existing intellectual property. We can have legal review the details. There's no reason to turn this into a fight. I've already contacted my lawyer. The confidence disappeared from his face. You did what? I also returned the marriage license. He stared at me. Why would you do that? Because you left. I told you I needed 20 minutes. You were gone for the entire afternoon. The situation changed. No, the excuse changed. He glanced at the open boxes beside the shelves. What are you doing? Packing. His eyes returned to mine. You're not serious. I accepted the Gulf regional position. I'm moving to New Orleans. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he laughed once, sharply, as though the absurdity of my decision would disappear if he refused to respect it. You rejected that job. I hadn't responded. We agreed you would stay in Boston. You decided I would stay. I stopped arguing. You're throwing away our life because I helped my widowed sister-in-law and my nephew? There is no fourth wedding, Matthew. He dragged a hand through his hair. You're trying to force me to choose. I already asked you to choose. 3 times. So this is punishment? You move across the country unless I abandon them. I never asked you to abandon them. I asked you to stop abandoning me. I have responsibilities. So do I. I had a responsibility to the woman sitting alone at that courthouse. I finally kept it. His gaze shifted toward the velvet box. I bought you something beautiful because I knew you were disappointed. You think a necklace replaces a marriage? I think people who love each other make allowances when something goes wrong. Something did not go wrong. You made a choice. You knew what Andrew's family meant to me when you agreed to marry me. And you knew what my work meant to me when you put Camille's name on it. His expression hardened. The design belongs partly to Sterling Construction. Camille is only the public face. You'll still be the engineer behind it. The words settled between us. He believed this was a compromise. Camille would receive the stage, the title, the photographs, and the applause. I would remain invisible behind her, correcting calculations and making sure the structure did not fail. You can understand why that answer is worse, I said. He reached for the appointment form. You're exhausted. We'll discuss this tomorrow. There is nothing to discuss. We are not ending a 4-year relationship over one bad day. It wasn't one day. It was the day I finally stopped pretending the others didn't count. He went upstairs angry, certain sleep would return me to reason. A few minutes later, I carried another stack of books into the living room. The tablet we shared was charging beside the sofa. It screen-lit as a message synchronized from Matthew's phone. Camille's name appeared at the top. Beneath it was the last message Matthew had sent her that afternoon. Don't worry about the wedding. Sloan is reasonable. She always waits. I did not open their conversation. I did not search for proof of an affair or read private messages that did not concern me. I photographed the notification because it directly documented what he believed about my absence from my own life. Then I sent the image to my attorney for preservation. For years, I had wondered whether Matthew understood how much his choices hurt me. Now I had my answer. He understood that I was waiting. He depended on it. My patience had not taught him to value me. It had taught him that every promise could be broken without consequence. He believed my love made me permanent, no matter how often he made me secondary. I placed my engagement ring on top of the 4th appointment form. The diamond caught the light from the hallway, bright and useless against the blank line where a new date was supposed to go. He had not forgotten our wedding. He had simply believed I would keep offering him another one. I left Sterling Construction without taking a single file the company could later claim belonged to it. My attorney arranged the separation as if we were preparing for litigation, because by then we understood that Matthew's belief in his own fairness was not something we could use as legal protection. Under the supervision of an independent records specialist, I returned my company laptop, security card, project tablet, and every external drive Sterling had issued to me. My access to internal servers, engineering software, and company email was terminated while the specialist watched. All files created during my employment were copied into a sealed archive. The archive did not belong to me or Sterling until ownership could be determined. Neither side could alter, delete, or selectively produce its contents without leaving a record. I retained only the material my employment contract explicitly recognized as mine: the original SafeSpan research, structural calculations, graduate models, preliminary drawings, and patent applications that predated my arrival at Sterling. 3 independent sources verified the timeline. My university preserved the original research submission records. A structural engineering laboratory confirmed the dates of my earliest load tests. The patent attorney who had filed my provisional application produced the signed documents and payment history. Every page had a timestamp. Every model had a creation record. Every engineering seal could be traced to the day it had been applied. I wanted my exit to be so clean that Matthew could search the floor behind me and find nothing to accuse me of stealing. He signed the termination of our engagement through his lawyer, although he continued sending messages as if the documents were merely evidence that I needed time to calm down. He offered to purchase a condominium for me in New Orleans. I declined. He offered to arrange movers. I hired my own. He offered to introduce me to donors who might support the Gulf Regional Resilience Program. I reminded him that the program had hired me without his assistance. Camille made one public statement after reporters noticed that the engineer originally associated with the Coastal Center was no longer employed by Sterling. "It is heartbreaking," she said, "when personal jealousy threatens work created to honor a man who devoted his life to helping others." I did not respond online. I did not tell strangers that Camille had accepted credit for a design she could not explain. I did not release Matthew's message about the wedding or describe the 3 empty chairs that had finally taught me to leave. My lawyer sent a formal notice instead. Sterling Construction retained permission to complete the single pilot project already covered by our existing agreement. It did not have the right to reproduce SafeSpan, license its core system, create unauthorized derivatives, or publicly represent itself as the owner of my pre-existing technology. Matthew's attorney acknowledged receipt. Then I moved to New Orleans. The life waiting for me there was not glamorous enough to fit inside one of Camille's foundation videos. The Gulf Regional Resilience Program occupied the 3rd floor of an old municipal building where the elevator stopped working whenever the humidity rose. My office had a water stain across the ceiling and an air conditioning vent that rattled like loose machinery. The budget I inherited was 18% lower than the amount discussed during my interviews. 2 rural hospitals refused to meet with me because they had already endured 3 visiting innovation teams that produced reports, photographs, and no usable infrastructure. Our first mobile clinic prototype leaked during a simulated rain test. Not a small leak. Water ran through the joint above the treatment bay, soaked a cabinet of demonstration supplies, and collected beneath the examination table while the project staff stood outside pretending not to watch my reaction. The backup battery system failed during a high-temperature test 2 weeks later. Its manufacturer had certified it for Gulf conditions based on average temperatures rather than the heat trapped inside a sealed utility enclosure. The parish government responded by suggesting we reduce testing requirements. If the prototype passes the standard inspection, why are we paying to create worse conditions? One official asked. Because hurricanes do not read standard inspection reports, I said. I did not have Matthew's money to solve the problems. I did not have the Sterling name to frighten vendors into replacing equipment at a loss. So I rebuilt the project from the people outward. I spent mornings with emergency nurses who had treated patients during generator failures. I rode with paramedics through communities where a flooded bridge could turn a 12-minute route into an hour. I met pregnant women who had evacuated 3 parishes away because the nearest local shelter had nowhere private or sanitary for an examination. Older residents showed me portable oxygen concentrators that could not be charged during extended outages. Dialysis patients explained why an evacuation plan was useless if accessible transportation arrived after the roads closed. Parents described trying to keep refrigerated medication cold inside plastic coolers. We moved the battery system into a ventilated, shaded enclosure and divided the power network so one equipment failure could not disable the entire clinic. We redesigned the roof joints, replaced the original seals, and tested them until rain struck the building horizontally without reaching the treatment bay. We lowered costs by simplifying finishes, not by deleting safety systems. Slowly, the hospitals began speaking to us. Then they began trusting us. My team grew to include engineers, nurses, accessibility specialists, logistics planners, and local contractors who understood which roads flooded before official maps admitted it. Jonah Reyes managed regional emergency coordination. He was responsible for evacuation routes, vehicle staging, shelter capacity, fuel reserves, and the difficult arithmetic of moving people before everyone agreed movement was necessary. We argued during our first meeting. He wanted one mobile clinic positioned beside the interstate for rapid deployment. I wanted it farther inland on reinforced ground. If it takes 40 minutes to reach the highway, it isn't mobile, he said. If the staging site floods, it isn't a clinic. He unfolded 3 evacuation maps across my desk. I opened the soil and drainage surveys beside them. Neither of us raised our voice. Neither of us suggested that the other was being emotional, territorial, or difficult. We studied the evidence until we found a 3rd site with stable ground and 2 usable road connections. That became our pattern. Jonah challenged my assumptions about movement. I challenged his assumptions about structures. When an issue belonged to medical engineering, he deferred to me. When it involved evacuation timing, I listened to him. Respect did not make us agree. It made disagreement useful. 8 months after I arrived, Jonah asked me to dinner. We chose a small restaurant in the Garden District for 7:30 on a Thursday. At 6:25, while I was changing clothes, my phone rang. I have a levee sensor reporting displacement near Plaquemines, he said. Behind him, I could hear radios and people moving quickly. It may be an equipment error, but I need to go. For one irrational second, I saw a gray chair beside me in the courthouse. Then Jonah said, "Don't wait for me. Go home. I'll call tomorrow, and you can decide if you still want another dinner." He did not promise 20 minutes. He did not ask me to sit in the restaurant while his emergency expanded to fill the evening. "Handle the levee," I said. The next morning, he called at 9:14. The warning had been caused by soil movement near a damaged sensor housing, not a failure in the levee itself. He explained that in 2 sentences, apologized once, and asked whether I would still like to have dinner the following week. There were no flowers delivered to my office. No jewelry. No speech about how a woman who understood the importance of his work should forgive the inconvenience. He simply asked again. I said yes. Whatever grew between us did so slowly. We had dinner when our schedules allowed. We learned how to separate professional disagreement from personal disappointment. He never tried to fund my work, speak for me, or convert his contacts into influence I had not earned. He also never treated my time as a room he could leave and expect to find unchanged when he returned. Respect, I realized, did not mean emergencies would never interrupt a life. It meant no one expected another person's life to remain frozen while the emergency was handled. Nearly 2 years after I left Boston, an approval notice for the Andrew Sterling Coastal Relief Center appeared in a public database. I found it because SafeSpan was still listed among my active intellectual property monitoring terms. The center was scheduled to open near the Louisiana coast before the peak of hurricane season. Camille was identified as its founder and principal design visionary. Sterling Construction was the primary contractor. Matthew had signed the executive authorization. My name did not appear anywhere. I downloaded the public plans expecting to find only the single pilot structure Sterling had been authorized to complete. Instead, I found an extensively modified version of SafeSpan. The raised foundation, modular treatment wings, independent utility core, and flood-resistant shell all followed my original system closely enough that portions of the drawings retained the same measurement sequence I had created during graduate school. Sterling had exceeded the pilot license. It had reproduced the design, altered it, and presented the result as a new company-owned system. But the missing attribution was not what frightened me most. SafeSpan's below-grade medical zone had been designed around 4 hydrostatic pressure release corridors. During a storm surge, water could saturate the surrounding soil and push inward against the underground walls. The corridors directed that pressure toward reinforced drainage chambers, where redundant pumps and mechanical gates prevented the load from concentrating against a single section of wall. The 4 corridors were not decorative redundancies. They were the reason the underground treatment area could exist safely. In Sterling's approved plans, 3 had been removed. Only the eastern corridor remained, and its intake capacity had not been increased to compensate. I searched the public change orders. Camille had objected to the original corridors because they reduced usable floor space. One interfered with the donor wall. Another required access panels in a corridor selected for media tours. Maintaining all 4 would increase annual operating costs, and the foundation wanted to expand the shelter's advertised capacity. A Sterling project engineer had formally opposed the change. His report warned that a single relief corridor could become blocked by storm debris and would not safely distribute pressure during a major surge. A later memorandum overruled him. The electronic approval belonged to Matthew. I read the documents twice before calling my attorney. Then I prepared a safety notice that contained no reference to our former engagement, the courthouse, or Camille's interviews. I included the original pressure calculations, the altered load model, the consequences of debris obstruction, and the probable failure pattern along the western section of the lower medical wall. I listed the necessary corrections: restore at least 3 independent relief paths, increase monitoring points, add manual gate access, and relocate critical electrical and oxygen systems until the work was complete. The notice went to Sterling Construction, the center's board, the parish building authority, the state health department, and its insurer. Matthew called the following afternoon. "You should have contacted me first." I contacted every responsible party at the same time. "You made it look like Sterling concealed a dangerous defect. The change order is public. Your approval is attached. Our engineers certified the final building. One of your engineers warned you not to remove the corridors. We hired another structural consultant. After the first one refused to approve the change. His silence confirmed that he knew exactly which report I meant. Sloan, this center is about to open," he said. "Hundreds of families are depending on it. Then correct the structure before they enter it. You don't have authority over the project anymore. Hydrostatic pressure does not care who has authority." 2 days later, Sterling Construction filed an intellectual property complaint against me and the Gulf Regional Resilience Program. The company claimed SafeSpan had been substantially developed during my employment and that Sterling possessed rights to all derivative designs. Matthew also issued a public statement questioning whether my government position had been used to pursue a personal dispute against my former fiancé. Camille's interview aired that evening. She stood in the bright entrance of the new center beside a bronze portrait of Andrew. "Grief built this center," she said. "Jealousy is trying to tear it down." The statement spread faster than my engineering report. Commentators who had never read a pressure calculation debated whether I resented Camille's beauty, her widowhood, or her continuing relationship with Matthew. Photographs from my abandoned courthouse ceremony appeared beside images of the center. The Gulf program placed my involvement under ethics review. I surrendered decision-making authority over any official response involving Sterling. I provided my employment contract, patent history, communications, calculations, and the complete timeline of my safety warning. Jonah met me in the records room while I organized the documents into labeled boxes. He did not promise to make the investigation disappear. He did not call friends in state government or tell reporters that he knew I was a good person. "What do you need?" he asked. "I need the record to remain complete." He pulled an empty archive box toward him. "Tell me how you want it organized." That was all. The review panel confirmed that my technical concerns could remain in the public file while it investigated the conflict allegations. However, because Sterling's replacement consultant had certified the design and the building authority had already approved occupancy, the opening was allowed to proceed. The center began accepting patients and shelter registrations in August. Every warning I had issued remained attached to the record. None of them stopped the doors from opening. 6 weeks later, Hurricane Iris formed in the Caribbean. The name felt like a bad joke, but there was nothing amusing about the forecast. The storm was originally expected to turn east. Instead, a high-pressure system strengthened over the Atlantic and forced it toward the central Gulf Coast. Within 18 hours, the projected landfall shifted more than 100 miles west. Jonah's Coordination Center activated evacuation protocols. The Andrews Sterling Coastal Relief Center was designated a primary shelter because it was new, modern, and advertised as capable of withstanding a major hurricane. Residents began arriving by bus. Pregnant women were placed in the underground medical zone. Older patients with limited mobility occupied rooms beside the service elevator. Nurses connected oxygen-dependent residents to the center's backup power network. Families who could not evacuate inland filled the upper shelter floors. Camille and Owen were already there for a foundation event when the evacuation order was issued. Rather than leave, Camille announced that she would remain with the community Andrews Center had been built to protect. Matthew flew in before the airport closed. I sent another written warning to the Emergency Management Office and the center's command team. Do not use the underground medical area during surge conditions. Transfer oxygen-dependent patients, pregnant women, and residents requiring powered medical equipment before the coastal roads become impassable. Jonah added my structural analysis to the regional risk assessment, but he could not unilaterally close a privately operated shelter that still held a valid occupancy certificate. Matthew joined our emergency call. Moving those patients now will create unnecessary risk, he said. The building has been inspected and approved. The remaining pressure corridor cannot support the projected surge if its intake becomes obstructed. You have already placed that objection on record. And the hurricane has now moved into the exact risk range described in that objection. The center was built for this. The original system was built for this. You removed 3/4 of it. Camille's voice entered the call. People are watching us. If we evacuate the newest shelter on the coast, every family inside will panic. Move the high-risk patients before panic becomes the least important problem you have. Matthew exhaled sharply. We cannot evacuate a building because you think something might happen. That is what structural safety is, acting before the wall proves me right. He refused. By midnight, the outer bands reached the coast. The wind drove rain against my apartment windows hard enough to shake the glass. I reported to Jonah's Coordination Center, where road closures, shelter counts, hospital capacity, and rescue requests moved across an entire wall of screens. At 1:18 a.m., the storm made landfall. The surge arrived faster than the center's public models predicted. Water crossed the access road and flooded the landscaped grounds. Beneath the building, saturated soil pressed against the underground structure from 3 directions. The single eastern pressure corridor opened automatically. For 11 minutes, it carried more than twice its intended load. Then wind-driven debris entered the exterior intake. Plastic sheeting, branches, insulation, and part of a temporary event banner collected against the grate. The corridor blocked. At 1:43, the center's lower wall monitors issued the first alarm. At 1:46, water appeared along the western service passage. At 1:49, the backup electrical network began reporting ground faults near the oxygen storage room. Sterling's cloud-based building controls attempted to contact a remote server for authorization to open the secondary maintenance gates. The hurricane had already destroyed the communication link. At 1:52, my phone rang. Matthew's name appeared on the screen for the first time in 7 months. When I answered, alarms were sounding behind him. Someone was shouting for a nurse. I heard a child crying and a man repeatedly asking why the elevator had stopped. Matthew's voice no longer carried the calm certainty he had used during the emergency call. The lower wall is moving, he said. Water is coming through the western passage. The control system won't open the maintenance gates. I pulled up the warning I had sent 2 years earlier. Every failure unfolding inside the center was listed there. Where are the medical patients? I asked. Most are still downstairs. We're trying to move them, but the service elevator lost power. A second alarm began behind him. We need the original access sequence, he said. The one from SafeSpan. I could have told him to call the Sterling engineers who had certified Camille's changes. I could have reminded him that he had accused me of jealousy, challenged my ownership, and placed my career under investigation for describing the danger now breaking through his walls. But more than 200 people were inside that building. They had not removed the safety corridors. They had not taken my name off the plans. They had not decided that Camille's reputation mattered more than the warning of an engineer. I turned toward Jonah and reached for the emergency operations headset. I had stopped waiting for Matthew a long time ago. The people inside that building could not afford to wait for either of us. Jonah opened a direct emergency channel to the Andrews Sterling Coastal Relief Center while I pulled the original SafeSpan plans onto the main screen. Matthew was still on the phone. Behind him, alarms overlapped with shouted instructions and the mechanical announcement ordering residents away from the western passage. Before I gave him the access sequence, I set 3 conditions. Every call, command, and system action stays on the record. No private line and no deleted logs. Agreed. Everyone on site follows my instructions exactly. If one of your engineers changes the sequence, I stop directing the operation. Agreed. And you disclose every piece of structural information you have. You do not protect Sterling, Camille, or yourself by withholding data. His answer took longer. Agreed. I looked at the live shelter count on Jonah's screen. 214 people remained inside, including 31 patients in the underground medical area. I am not doing this for you, I said. I am doing it because you filled an unsafe building with people who trusted your name. I understand. No, you understand that the wall is moving. We can discuss the rest after everyone is alive. I transferred the original maintenance drawings to the emergency channel. The western wall had shifted 14 millimeters. It was serious, but not yet catastrophic. SafeSpan's reinforced shell had been designed to tolerate limited movement while pressure was redirected. Sterling had deleted 3 of the 4 pressure release corridors, but 2 narrow maintenance passages from the original design remained behind finished wall panels. Camille's team had sealed them because the access doors interrupted the appearance of the lower hallway. They had hidden the last possible route to relieve the pressure. First, isolate the underground oxygen manifold, I instructed. A nurse interrupted. We have 9 patients receiving continuous oxygen. Move them to portable cylinders before closing the main valve. No electrical switching near the storage room until the line is isolated. If that damaged circuit arcs in an oxygen-enriched space, we could have a flash fire. Matthew repeated the order to the clinical team. Second, move every critical patient to the second-floor conference hall. Use the eastern stairwell. No elevators and no one enters the western corridor. The conference hall isn't equipped for medical care, Camille said through the open channel. It has power outlets on 2 independent circuits, reinforced windows, and enough floor space for portable beds. That room was prepared for press briefings. Tonight it is an intensive care staging area. We cannot destroy the center every time you issue an order. Water struck something near Matthew's phone. People shouted. Then his voice cut through the channel. Do exactly what Sloan says. It was the first time I had ever heard him overrule Camille. It did not redeem him. It did not return my name to the plans or erase the warnings he had ignored. It only proved that when death became immediate enough, he finally admitted whose judgment mattered. I enlarged the maintenance drawings. Matthew, go to the South Utility Passage. There should be a finished panel between markers S14 and S16. I see a donor display. The display is covering the first maintenance hatch. Remove it. Camille protested again. That wall contains Andrew's memorial installation. Then take his photograph down carefully, I said. But the wall is coming down. Jonah muted the center's audio for a moment. How much time? He asked. I studied the pressure readings. Less than 40 minutes before the western wall reaches its design limit. Possibly 20 if the surge rises. Jonah turned toward the transportation desk. I need high-water vehicles at the north entrance. Redirect ambulances to the service ramp on the East Ridge. Open the temporary clinic at St. Bernadette High School. Outside the center, wind speeds were still too high for ordinary evacuation vehicles. Jonah analyzed the radar and found a narrow interval behind the hurricane's strongest inner band. 28-minute window, he said. It begins in 11. Inside the center, workers removed the memorial display and broke through the finished panel. Behind it, they found the first maintenance hatch exactly where my original drawings placed it. The access mechanism had no power. I gave Matthew the manual release sequence. Turn the upper wheel counterclockwise 6 rotations. Hold the lower lever down while someone pulls the locking pin. It isn't moving. Because the frame is under pressure. Do not force the pin. Brace the lever, turn the wheel 1 additional rotation, and try again. Metal shrieked through the channel. Then the hatch opened. Water rushed into the maintenance passage. The western wall movement slowed, but did not stop. Now open the second passage. That one leads toward the storage wing, Matthew said. It leads to the sacrificial equalization chamber. That area is full of emergency supplies. Move what you can in 3 minutes. Camille's voice sharpened. Those supplies cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The wall is holding back several million gallons of water. No one argued after that. The second hatch was buried behind a non-load-bearing partition installed during the center's expansion. Matthew's construction supervisor hesitated to demolish it without written authorization. This channel is your authorization, I said. Remove panels between columns C9 and C11. Do not touch the reinforced columns. Workers used rescue axes and pry bars to open the partition. Water entered the empty storage bay, spreading across a reinforced floor designed to accept controlled flooding. The pressure graph dropped for the first time. I directed the fire crew to connect portable pumps to the equalization chamber and discharge toward the eastern drainage slope. The pumps could not overcome the entire surge, but they could slow the accumulation long enough to evacuate. Western corridor movement is down to 3 millimeters per minute, a technician reported. It was still too fast. Jonah's weather interval began. The first high-water vehicle reached the elevated entrance. Pregnant patients, children, and oxygen-dependent residents were moved first. Ambulances waited on higher ground rather than risking the flooded access road. The second-floor conference hall became a transfer station. Nurses stabilized patients, replaced oxygen cylinders, and grouped evacuees by destination. Jonah tracked available hospital beds while I watched the structural sensors. We were no longer working as two people trying to prove who had been right. He moved the residents. I kept the building standing long enough for him to do it. Camille reached the exit with Owen, but the boy froze when the outer doors opened. Wind screamed through the covered entrance. Water surrounded the rescue vehicle's tires, and the rotating emergency lights turned the rain red. I can't make him move, Camille said. He can't breathe. His medical readings showed no asthma crisis. He was panicking. I activated the center's internal broadcast. Owen, this is Sloan. I need you to listen to my voice. His crying came faintly through Matthew's phone. Stay low. Put one hand on your mother's arm. Breathe in while I count to 3. I counted. Now breathe out while I count to 5. We repeated it twice. You do not have to look at the water, I told him. Look at the blue reflective line on the floor. Follow it to the vehicle. One marker at a time. Camille began counting with me. Owen moved. I did not help them because Camille deserved my forgiveness. I helped because a frightened child should not inherit the consequences of adult choices. At 2:37 a.m., the final medical transport departed. Matthew and the remaining rescue personnel followed in the last high-water vehicle. Jonah confirmed every name against the shelter registry. 214 people evacuated. No one was missing. 12 minutes later, the western underground wall partially failed. The controlled flooding chambers absorbed enough of the initial collapse to prevent the upper structure from destabilizing. By then, the building was empty. No one died. 7 residents were treated for minor injuries, and 2 rescue workers required stitches. The entire operation, from Matthew's first call to the final vehicle leaving, had been recorded on the public emergency channel. By sunrise, cameras were positioned along the police barrier outside the center. Camille spoke to reporters before investigators had entered the building. The Andrews Sterling Coastal Relief Center survived a historic hurricane, she said. Our evacuation procedures worked exactly as intended because of the advanced engineering developed by Sterling Construction. A reporter asked about my role. Sloan provided remote advice using systems created during her time with Sterling. We appreciate every former employee who contributed to the company's work. Matthew stood behind her. For several seconds, I expected him to repeat the lie. He did not. His silence was not courage, but it was the first time he refused to place his credibility beneath Camille's version of events. I did not argue with her on television. Rescue recordings could prove that my instructions had worked. They could not, by themselves, establish who owned SafeSpan or who had created the danger. That required evidence. Before leaving the emergency center, I sent preservation requests to the State Engineering Board, the Building Authority, the Government Contracts Office, and the court handling the intellectual property dispute. I requested the immediate seizure and preservation of the building's sensor data, every version of the design files, change approvals, storm communications, Sterling's server access logs, and the internal correspondence between Camille, Matthew, and the engineering team. 3 weeks later, the public hearing began. The State Engineering Board sat jointly with the Government Contract Review Office. An independent digital audit firm presented its findings under oath. The hearing was live-streamed because the center had received public funding and served as an official emergency shelter. I did not testify about the necklace Matthew bought after abandoning our wedding. I did not show his message saying I always waited. I began with the engineering record. Exhibit 1 contained the original SafeSpan drawings completed before I joined Sterling Construction. Exhibit 2 contained my dated university research, laboratory testing records, engineering seals, and provisional patent filing. Exhibit 3 was the attachment to my employment contract confirming that SafeSpan's core framework remained my pre-existing intellectual property. Exhibit 4 was the licensing agreement granting Sterling permission to construct one pilot center, not reproduce the system, claim ownership, or create unauthorized derivatives. The digital auditors verified that none of those records had been created or altered after my departure. Then came Sterling's records. Matthew had emailed my complete SafeSpan archive to Camille's project team with instructions to adapt the system as necessary under the Sterling name. Meeting transcripts showed Camille demanding the removal of 3 pressure release corridors because they consumed usable space, increased maintenance costs, and interfered with the donor wall and media route. A project engineer had refused to approve the modification. His written objection predicted that debris could block the single remaining corridor and concentrate hydrostatic pressure against the western underground wall. Management removed him from the project. Matthew approved the change 4 days later. My formal safety warnings appeared next, followed by Sterling's intellectual property complaint against me. The timestamps showed that the company had challenged my professional conduct only after I documented the structural defect. Finally, investigators presented the storm data. The remaining pressure corridor had become obstructed exactly as my report predicted. The western wall had deformed within the range calculated in my warning. The original maintenance passages and sacrificial flooding chamber had prevented an immediate collapse. The evacuation recordings established that I had directed the emergency response using features from my original SafeSpan design. The independent audit reached 6 conclusions. SafeSpan's core technology belonged to me. Sterling had copied and modified it beyond the limits of its license. Camille had interfered with safety-critical engineering decisions despite possessing no engineering qualifications. Matthew had bypassed the normal review process because of his personal relationship with her. Sterling had submitted misleading safety assurances to government agencies despite documented internal objections. My warnings had been technically accurate, properly disclosed, and motivated by public safety. Matthew testified after me. He looked older than he had 3 weeks earlier. He no longer wore the sterling executive pin on his lapel. When my attorney asked why he had approved Camille's changes, he did not blame grief or confusion. I believed I could protect her from embarrassment and rely on Sloan to correct any technical problems later. You had already accused Ms. Bennett of using safety concerns for personal revenge. Yes. Why would you expect her to help you? His eyes found mine across the hearing room. Because she always had. When I returned to the witness table, the board chair asked whether I wanted to respond. Matthew did not give Camille only our wedding day, I said. He gave her my name, my work, and the authority to overrule warnings she did not understand. The room became completely still. Love, grief, and gratitude may explain a choice, I continued. They do not erase its consequences. The final orders were issued over the following month. Camille was removed as director of the center. The building entered an independent safety reconstruction program. Sterling Construction lost its government emergency infrastructure contracts and was ordered to pay damages for unauthorized use of SafeSpan. The state reopened investigations into the consultants who had certified the altered design. Matthew resigned as chief executive. Sterling's family-controlled board also lost its special veto over the company's safety committee. Future engineering objections could no longer be overturned by one executive without independent review. Matthew made one public statement. I gave Camille Sloan's work for the same reason I gave her our wedding day. I believed Sloan would absorb the loss and stay. For once, he did not call what he had done kindness. I did not ask the state to demolish the center. Coastal residents still needed it. Instead, I proposed an independent safety council made up of engineers, nurses, disabled residents, rural physicians, emergency coordinators, and family caregivers. The people who understood what a shelter needed because they would live with its failures. Part of the settlement funded resilient medical clinics in remote Gulf communities. I did not return to Sterling or accept a restored title inside someone else's company. The Gulf program expanded, and I was appointed to lead its permanent engineering authority. The power I gained was not a position Matthew finally returned to me. I had built it. Several months later, he came to New Orleans. We met in a public garden near my office. He told me he had begun therapy and was learning to separate his grief for Andrew from his need to rescue Camille from every consequence. I thought caring for them made me loyal, he said. I didn't see what I was doing to you. You saw it, I replied. You believed I would survive it. He lowered his head. I could move here. We could begin again. You did not lose me because you cared for a widow and a child. You lost me because you kept asking me to disappear so you could call every choice kindness. I'm changing. I hope you are. It was true. But regret did not create a new beginning, and improvement did not make the past disappear. His change belonged to the life he would build after me. 1 year later, Jonah and I chose a Friday morning at the New Orleans courthouse. There were no foundation donors, television cameras, or expensive flowers. I wore a cream-colored dress and carried no bouquet. I arrived 20 minutes early. Jonah was already in the waiting area with 2 cups of coffee beside him. You don't have to arrive first to prove you're different from Matthew, I said. I know. He handed me one of the cups. I came early because I wanted to be here. When the clerk called our names, Jonah stood and offered me his hand. He did not pull me toward the door. He did not promise a future on my behalf. He waited for my answer. I placed my hand in his. For years, I had waited for someone else to choose me. This time, I walked through the door because the choice was mine.